If I asked you to define a noun, you'd probably say it was the name of a person, place, or thing. And if I asked you to define a verb, you'd probably say it expresses action or a state of being. But take a word like iron. If I asked you about iron, you might say, well, it's a noun that can be used as a verb, or a verb that can be used as a noun. In short, these definitions wouldn't help you very much. In just a few moments, we're going to show you how you can define a verb and a noun much more precisely by using structure rather than meaning. In our last program, we were talking about dialect variation. And actually, what we were working with were the phonemes, the sounds that entered into what we've been taught to call the same words in different parts of the country. In other words, words spelled the same way actually had different sounds in them. Now, what we're going to talk about today is the actual composition of words themselves. We're getting to that level that the linguist calls grammar. And the first level of grammar is the study of the composition of words, how these phonemes actually pattern into words. Now, the technical name for this particular part of linguistics is morphology. Morphology means, of course, the study of the forms of things. And that particular part of morphology that has to do with the word formation is technically called morphemics, because we find that the word is composed of what we call the morpheme. Now, the morpheme is actually the smallest significant grammatical unit, the smallest unit of combinations of sounds now that has grammatical significance. In just a moment, we're going to see what we mean by grammatical significance. But these morphemes actually are seen as we talk, or if we look at a text that's been written down, actually seen to come back over and over again. In other words, they recur. So what we're going to call, how we're going to identify morphemes first is to see them as recurring patterned partials. Recurring patterned partials. Let me show you what I mean. In the first place, the thing to remember is that if we take any stretch of utterance at all, we're going to find that certain items come back over and over again. They recur. For instance, here in these two sentences, he saw two other boys, each riding a horse, and each leading two much smaller horses. Strange as it may seem, astride each of the small horses' backs was a large Siamese cat, and the cats each wore a little clown's cap. Now, in this particular passage of two sentences, there are 42 words, and yet, of those 42 words, there are 29 recurring partials. That is, these things come back over and over again. Particularly notice that two occurs here with boys, two much smaller horses. In other words, the word two occurs here twice. Each occurs twice. The item small occurs twice. A occurs several times. Horse, horse. And I want particularly for you to notice these little partials right here that have the double underline. The S on the end of backs, the ES apostrophe on the end of horses, the S on the end of cats, the apostrophe S on the end of clown, the ES here on the end of horses. Now I'm going to show you the same passage written in phonemics. Here is what it looks like in phonemics, and here again are these particular items I just called your attention to. He saw two other boys. Notice it's a Z as a phoneme, not an S, but a Z. Two other boys, each riding a horse, and each leading two much smaller horses. Barred-eye Z here. And down here, barred-eye Z on horses' backs. Here an S on the end of backs, an S on the end of cats, a Z again on the end of clowns. Now these particular recurring partials, all of them, but particularly these that occur here now that we have double underlined, these are among the most important kinds of morphemes or recurring partials that we have. These are the things that actually give us grammatical significance. In other words, when I say two other boys, that particular z on the end of boys tells me I'm talking about more than one boy. Now, how does the linguist actually go about seeing what recurs and how these recurrences are related? He sees them in distribution frames. In distribution frames, like two in front of boy gives boys, so to speak. Let me show you what I mean. For instance, here we have the word boy, the word cat, and the word horse. These words that we were just looking at from our sentences with one in front of them. Now, when two occurs in front of them, the word two, in this particular distribution frame, notice what happens. One boy demands a Z phoneme, two boys. One cat, when you put two in front of it, it demands an S, two cats. And in the case of horse, what we get is two horses, a barred IZ. In other words, each time I put two in front of these three different words, I get a different occurrence out here. But actually, each one of these tells me I'm talking about more than one. It fits into the frame with two. Now, what the linguist does is to say, the recurrence of these particular noises, now these phonemes, they actually can be gathered together into a class. And the class he calls Z1. This is simply a cover symbol that now will cover all of the automatic variations, because as we're going to see in just a moment, there is a regular automatic necessity of having a Z here, an S here, and a barred IZ here. Here is our Z1 morpheme. Now what we're going to see is what rules, so to speak, govern the selection of the Z, the S, or the IZ. Here we have a statement of these particular distributions. If a word in the singular ends in a voiceless stop like P, T, or K, or a voiceless spirant like F or th, always we will have S as the allomorph, the member of the class of the morpheme Z1, the plural morpheme. These allomorphs are like the allophones of phonemes. They are now predictable in terms of what is going to occur. Notice that when I have a spirant like horse, z, quiz, sh, wish, j, garage, or an affricate like match, this is going to demand a barred IZ. The regular recurring allomorph of the big Z1 plural morpheme is now going to be barred IZ. Two horses, two quizzes, two wishes, two garages, two matches. Any other sound, that is, if the singular ends in any other phoneme, as in the case of these semivowels, boy, cow, or these voiced stops, club, add, dog, that is going to demand a Z. Two boys, two cows, two clubs, two adds, two dogs. This particular business now becomes very important to the linguist, to know where the kinds of things he adds are to be added and what kinds of additions there are going to be. In each case now, these things actually have grammatical significance. They are telling us plural. Now, sometimes the linguist, in trying to find out what these little recurring partials are and what their shape is and how they get added, sometimes he's liable to make a mistake. Let me show you what I mean. For instance, if we didn't know too much about English, and we had the word prince, and then we came across another word, princeling. Now, a princeling, of course, is a small prince, a little prince, a young prince, okay? Here we have a partial, L-I-N-G, that is added to the word prince. And we notice over here that we can say, for instance, the princeling's hat. And we've actually added another morpheme here to the end. This particular one, incidentally, is not the plural morpheme, this one with this apostrophe S. It's another morpheme, the morpheme of the possessive, which we can call morpheme Z2 as a cover class to distinguish it from morpheme Z1, the princeling's hat. Now, notice, we also find in English the sequence boy and the sequence boiling. Now you see what I've done is to draw this, write this in phonemics where I have that long N business that stands for the ing, you know, the sound in sing and so on. Here is boiling. Now, having boy and having boiling and having prince and having princeling, perhaps the linguist might fall in the trap of thinking you get prince is to princeling as boy is to boiling. But obviously that does not occur because we can't talk about the boiling's hat. So what you have to do is to find out where one part stops and the other part begins. Obviously, in this case, what we should have is boil is to boiling, as run is to running, ride is to riding. In other words, in this particular false case, we didn't know where one part stopped and the other part began. We confused a ling with an ing. And this ing now is, again, a member of a different morpheme. It is, if you will, the ending of the participle of a verb. So what we have to do is to know where we stop and where we start, to see how these particular recurring pattern partials get put together. Now, what the linguist does in going through this particular proposition is to realize one fact, which is very interesting, and I think this probably applies to all the languages of the world. I'm not sure, but I have a hunch it does. And that is this, that if we look at any word in any language, we can actually analyze it in terms of its morphemes, in terms of two great classes of morphemes. Those that we can call the base morphemes, those are the kernels, the very heart of the word, and those which we can call affixes. And the affixes are, as their name would imply, particular morphemes that are affixed to the base. In other words, we know such terms as prefix, suffix, infix. These are little morphemes that can be put in front of a base, that can be put inside of a base, and can follow a base. The suffix, of course, the kind that follows a base. And these particular examples we have here, as in this ing in boiling and the apostrophe s, that Z2, these are suffixes. They're put at the end of a base. Now, in terms of the way words in language operate, the bases of a language are inexhaustible. Every time you want to name a new item, you have to dream up a new base. You pull into your phoneme stock and you put some together and you got a new base, a new beginning of a word. The affixes, however, are always limited and fixed. In other words, you can't invent an affix, but you can invent bases. When Al Capp, for instance, wanted to name those wonderful little animals that he had, you know, that were the friend of mankind, the shmoo, well, actually what he did was to pull it out from the phoneme stock, a new combination, made up a new base, put a plural on it. You either get shmoon, as I think he first called the plural, one shmoo, two shmoon, or you can say two shmoos. That would be the normal way in which the plural would be formed. So he invented a base. Bases and affixes, then, and the linguist's first job is to be able to separate the bases from the affixes. Let me show you over here, again, how this particular thing works. To go back again for a moment to our business of the plural morpheme, our Z1. One boy, one cat, one horse, and so on. These are the regular allomorphs of our friend Z1, the plural. But suppose something like this happens. Here is an item, one sheep. Now what happens when I put two in front of sheep? One sheep, two sheep. Nothing happens, you say. Well, something does happen, actually. There is another allomorph of Z1. This one we call 0. And we symbolize it by that particular symbol, the 0 symbol. Now, 0 is not nothing in linguistics. At this level, 0 counts as a piece of structure just as much as this Z, this S, and that barred IZ. This 0 counts. This is going to be very important as we see, as we go on in seeing how morphemes work. Now, another thing about this particular kind of formation. What we've been looking at up to now have been bases plus suffixes. These particular things that tell us plural, that tell us past participle, that tell us possession, these are what we call grammatical suffixes. Now I'm going to show you that there are other kinds of morphemes that can be added to a base. For instance, let's take the base boy. Perfectly good base. Now, I can add something to this before I get to a suffix. For instance, I can add what I call a post base, ish, as in boyish. Perfectly good word so far, but I can add another one to it. I can say boyishness, another post base. Then if I want to put a plural suffix on it, I can select the proper automatic one that follows a s, and I come out with boyishnesses, which means more than one example of boyishness. Now notice what I've done here. I have actually extended my base by these post bases, which I have now added to this to give me a stem. In other words, from boy to, this is the base. These now added form me what I call a stem. And at the end of the stem, then, I can put my suffix. Now we've gotten to a point, actually, where we can define a word. There's only one thing now that's left off to be able to define what a word is in this language. And that is that we require not only a base, but we require what we call a stress pattern, or to use the technical term, a word superfix. What's that mean? It means this. No word can ever be said in this language of ours unless it has primary stress, at least one primary stress on it somewhere. For instance, if we didn't have this kind of absolute rigid requirement, we couldn't make the contrast, for instance, between I permit and one permit. In other words, the word permit is a noun, but in I permit, where the primary stress is on the second syllable, this turns it into a verb. Permit, permit, two different words because the word superfix is different. The word superfix. We must have a pattern of stress. In other words, to make this a real word, I would have to have primary stress on boy and weak stress on the rest of it. Boyishnesses. Here, then, is the definition of a word. A word in English must have one base, and it can only have one base. In addition to having one base, which must be composed, obviously, of at least one vowel or combination of vowels, we have to have a word superfix or stress pattern. We may have any number of post bases, and we may or may not have that grammatical suffix. Now, I have here what I am quite sure, I may be wrong, but I am quite sure, is the longest word in the English language. Anti-disestablishmentarianisms. Anti-disestablishmentarianisms. Now, I'm going to show you that although, incidentally, I don't think you'll find this in the dictionary. However, I'm going to show you that whether you find it in the dictionary or not, this is by our definition a word, and only one word. First thing I got to do is to find out its base. All right? There is a base here and only one, and that base is stab. There's the base. Now, obviously, this base in this form doesn't occur by itself. It has to have some pre-bases or a post-base on it. So, look what happens. If I put some pre-bases on it, I get establish. Now, here's my word superfix. Primary stress, here's the weak stress, and so on. Here are two post-bases, one pre-base. Establish. Then I can add another post-base to it. Establishment. Notice the change of the word superfix. Then I can get disestablishment. Notice the word superfix again as I add post-base and here pre-base. Then I can get disestablishmentarian, adding another post-base, but notice here the primary stress of the word superfix. Then I can get disestablishmentarianism. Then I can get anti by adding another pre-base in front of it, anti-disestablishmentarianism. Then I can put on my little suffix and I get anti-disestablishmentarianisms. Whether you find it in the dictionary or not, it has met our criterion for a word. One base only, a series of post-bases, pre-bases, a word superfix of quite complex shape, and the actual addition of a suffix. Now, one of the things a linguist can do is he can now classify his words. He can classify his words by whether they take suffixes and which suffixes they can take. This particular word now is a noun by definition because I can inflect it for Z1, the plural. Any word that can take the plural is by definition a noun. So anti-disestablishmentarianisms is a noun because I have the plural ending on it. By the same token, if I want to talk now about another class of words, the verb, probably the most important class of words in English, I can say that it can take other suffixes, other recurring patterned partials, morphemes of this kind. Let me show you now what a verb would look like. Here I have broken down the verb in terms of its 5 principal parts. That is, I start with my base form or name form, the form that occurs either with the preposition to or the pronoun I in front of it. I ride, to ride, I love, to love, and so on. This is the name form. We have another morpheme now, Z3, which is the so-called third-person singular that can be added to this stem, and we get rides, loves, hits, the familiar third-person singular. But here is the most important of all the verb morphemes. It is the one we call D1, the past tense morpheme. I rode, he loved, he hit, he would. And here the past participle, D2. It was ridden, it was loved, it was hit. And here the ing form, or the present participle, riding, loving, hitting. Now notice, to get a verb in this language, you have to have a word that is inflected for the past tense. If a word is inflected for D1, the past tense, it is by definition a verb, and you never have to bother about it anymore. Will is a verb because it has a past tense form, would. In other words, we have now two great classes of words that are inflected words, that take suffixes. And this is the way you can identify noun from verb every time. There's another important inflected word class in English, the pronoun. Now, the pronoun is not only an inflected class, but the pronoun is inflected for case, subject and object case, I, me. Two possessives. In other words, my and mine. My book, the book is mine. Our and ours. In other words, this particular thing is a highly inflected word class. A highly inflected word class. Please notice that we not only have here in the so-called third-person singular three forms, he, she, and it, which actually mark gender, but again, each one of these has an object case and a possessive, two possessive cases, his, her, hers, its. And down here, a very important pronoun, the so-called relative pronoun, which again has this inflection for object and subject case and for two possessives. Any class of words, then, that can have a subject and object morpheme inflection and can have two possessives is going to be classed as a pronoun. Now, please notice, in defining, then, in defining word classes, what we have been able to do is to identify these particular word classes by their form, by their structure, not by their meaning. I have identified and defined the noun by the fact it can be inflected for the plural and the possessive, C1 and C2. I have defined the verb that it can be inflected for D1, the past tense. I never have to worry now about iron. If I say she ironed the clothes, I know perfectly well that ironed is a verb because I've inflected it for D1. If I say she has plenty of irons in the fire, I have inflected it for Z1, so therefore irons in that particular case is a noun. But if I say she irons the clothes, that is a member of our Z3 that we had on the board a minute ago, the third person singular. So I can look at the frame in which the word occurs, and by looking at the suffixes, I can define it through structure and not through meaning. Now, in English, then, what we find is that the study of words and the classification of words, the whole business on what a word is, depends upon the following things. We have to realize that we have recurring patterned partials. That is, we have to realize that bases and affixes occur over and over again. And we have to find that bases and affixes are going to recur in certain orders. We're going to have to find that to get a word itself, that is, to have a word, we can only have one base. We also find another thing. We find, for instance, that our affixes are divided into two classes. That is, we have affixes that are suffixes, and those are the affixes that give us the grammatical relationship of past tense, of plural, and so on. And that these particular suffixes have allomorphs. That is, these morphemes have allomorphs. Automatic variations depending upon the shape of the base. So that, for instance, in the D1 morpheme, the past tense morpheme, I would expect to get allomorphs, such as barred ID, as in he decided, for instance. In the case of loved, it's simply an allomorph of shape D. And in the case of sleep slept, it's an allomorph in the shape T. In other words, we can gather these particular regular cases into a class and then see how that suffix class actually enables us to define an entire class of words. Now, it's true. Once I can identify a noun, and once I can identify a verb, once I can identify a pronoun, then I can go on and say that in terms of meaning, the noun generally refers to a person, place, or thing. A verb generally expresses action or a state of being. So that in what we've covered today, the important thing for us to remember is this. The word is not just something that we write on the printed page and leave spaces before and after it. Not at all. The word is a patterned entity in the language and can be defined very rigorously. extremely rigorously in terms of these criteria. To review them again, you have to have one base, and a word can only have one base. No matter how long it is, as in the case of anti-disestablishmentarianism, there's still only one base there. This is extremely important. If we have two bases, by definition, we've got two words. We've got more than one word. Now, this particular part of grammar that studies a word and shows us how words can be classified in terms of the suffixes they can take, this part of linguistics known as morphemics, gives us the basis to get into the study of the composition of more than one word. And when we have more than one word, we have what we call syntax. And the study of syntax is the study of phrases, the placing of more than one word together. Items, in other words, that are composed of two bases. Now, the study of syntax, the whole business of phrases, putting two words or more than two words together, building out until we get to the sentence. This is syntax, the next part of our particular concern of morphology. Now, next week, we are going to be talking about syntax. We're going to start and see how we build from our words into our phrases. Then we're going to see how these phrases, which are composed of more than one word, can be extended. We're going to see how the whole of grammar actually can be molded around a combination, again, of stresses. How these particular stresses tell us what goes with what when we're putting more than one word together. And we're also going to see how the intonation pattern, how this whole matter of intonation, the pitches, work with the stresses, and how this business gives us a phonological clue. That is, we can listen with our ears and tell when this stops and this begins, when this stops and this begins, and how this particular thing goes with this particular thing, and how that particular thing does not go with that particular thing. In other words, what we're going to show is this. In order to do grammar, we have got to get beyond the printed page. We have got to remember that writing is only an inconsistent and incomplete record of what really goes on in language. And that if we can listen, only listen, to the actual sounds that we make, here particularly the stresses and the intonations, we're going to be able to see how a sentence works. But that's for next week. The thing that I want you to remember now is that a word can only have one base and must have one base and a word superfix on it, a stress pattern. So will you be with us next week when we take up syntax? How more than one word goes with more than one word. How we build a sentence.